All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to part 2 of our 7th annual Policy Summit. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Greg Torres. I chair the board of Mass Inc., and along with Wayne Budd, Max Stern, and Kevin Burke, one of the co-founders of the Massachusetts Criminal Justice Reform Coalition. Before we begin, I want to thank our sponsors who are responsible for underwriting this event. First of all, the Shaw Foundation, the Boston Foundation, Community Resources for Justice, and our good friend, Al Caneb. Now, before we get into our latest research and our panel discussion, we want to take a moment to both recognize and thank one of the members of our coalition, John Larivee, recently retired head of Community Resources for Justice. Now, John and I worked together for a long time. Going back to the 70s, he was starting out at the Deer Island House of Correction, and I was at the Rosendale Detention Center. And you fast forward 40 plus years, and well, here we are still at it. I've always admired John's work, his professionalism, his sense of purpose around community corrections, and his leadership at CRJ. But today we want to recognize John for his work with the coalition, which he started by co-authoring this report with Ben Foreman. Crime, Cost, and Consequences. Is it time to get smart on crime? Now, he started working on this in 2012, and the report was released in March of 2013. And in the letter that introduces the report, signed by Wayne Budd, Kevin Burke, and Max Stern, they say, in this first report, the coalition seeks to provide the public with information on the real costs of our current approach to criminal justice. As crime rates continue to drop nationally and here in Massachusetts, the state's prison population spirals ever higher because of outdated, tough on crime policies that have more political than practical value. Kind of well said. The report, which is still a good read, called for a criminal justice reform agenda and set the stage for the almost decade of hard work that came next. Now, whenever the co-chairs would convene to launch new research, review legislation, figure out which policies to support or oppose, John was at every single one of those meetings. He gave us the practitioner's perspective. He could go from the big picture to how the system works on the ground in no time. Became a very trusted advisor to us and the co-chairs. So to the extent that we've made progress over the years, a great deal of credit goes to John Larivee for the behind the scenes role that he played in the coalition's work. That's why we wanted to recognize you today, John, and thank you for staying with us on the journey. And congrats on your retirement. I hope it means you'll have more time to spend with us working on the implementation of the 2018 legislation. Now, if we were at the UMass Club with 400 people in the room like we usually have, we would call for a standing O for you and everybody would be on their feet. But thanks to the world of Zoom, you're going to have to settle for silent applause, which is kind of consistent with your behind the scenes approach. So congratulations, John, and please say a few words.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Greg. I can hear that silent applause right now ringing in my ears. I want not only thank you, but also want to thank Lauren Grogan and Mass Inc. and to the Massachusetts Criminal Justice Reform Coalition. I hope you can see my my plaque here that was sent my way. I appreciate it very much. I am truly honored, and Community Resources for Justice is truly honored. Anything that I may have accomplished over the course of my career was done with the support and assistance of a lot of people at CRJ, as well as many others. Greg, I remember our earliest engagement on a criminal justice agenda focused on overcrowding of the Commonwealth's prisons and jails, a product of the tough on crime policies and laws of that era. Our efforts were aimed at fighting the expansion of mandatory sentencing and other punitive sanctions. The hallmarks of that era were record prison populations housed in double bunked single cells, classrooms, program space, administrative offices, even armories. We also saw the deconstruction of celebrated and effective reentry programs, pre-release services, and furloughs, despite evidence. Today, thanks to the efforts of Mass Inc., CRJ, and many others, we're focused on advancing progressive options. The reform agenda is stronger and popular. Today, there's an acknowledgement that we must better serve the behavioral health needs of individuals caught in the criminal justice system, including diverting them out of the system. Today, there's acceptance by many of the value and need to provide effective reentry services to prepare individuals for their return to the community. I applaud this forum for bringing focus to the questions of effectiveness of public safety expenditures and of shifting funding to mental health and other social services. Fortunately for the reform efforts, there are many good examples with strong evidence of effectiveness, like Cahoots in Eugene, Oregon, an effective alternative that uses behavioral health system first response instead of police to respond to people experiencing homelessness or behavioral health or mental health crisis, like drug courts, mental health courts, and other problem-solving courts that provide a sentencing alternative of treatment in lieu of incarceration, like community-based reentry centers, where individuals serve the final months of their sentence in the community while securing employment, housing, treatment in advance of release. Clearly, the work is far from done. Change of any system, especially the criminal justice system, is very difficult. While Massachusetts has implemented some of the above alternatives and others, they are still seen as experiments or pilots or alternatives. They've not replaced more traditional responses. As Ben Foreman has written, despite the steady declining population in the Commonwealth's prisons and jails, we still operate facilities with capacity for over 21,000, holding just 12,000 individuals. The state is paying for over 9,000 empty cells. So our reform efforts must push forward, and that will take continued efforts by the Reform Coalition, Mass Inc., CRJ, and others. I look forward to continuing to participate in those efforts. And again, thank you very much for this honor.
I think I may be experiencing technical difficulties here. So once again, I'm going to thank John for his comments and move on to introduce Ben Foreman. But before I do that, just a couple of comments on the themes running through this summit. Our first session last week, Rooting Out Racial Bias, explored the sharp racial disparities in the Commonwealth's prison population. In this session, we turn to the matter of what does the trended data tell us? What opportunities exist for rethinking and refunding corrections? And we try to explore these questions through the lens of the frontline workers, correctional officers. We'll see some very good news in population trends, a 50% reduction in both state and county populations. Think about that, a 50% reduction from where we were when we started this work to today. So part of our goal was bending the curve on mass incarceration, and we've clearly made progress on that front. But as Professor Ramirez reminded us last week, the remaining population is still disproportionately Black and brown. We incarcerate Blacks at 8 times the rate of whites, Latinx at 5 times the rate. How does that compare to other states? We're the highest in the nation for Latinx disparities and the 13th highest for Black people. We only need to go back and read Ben Foreman's report on the geography of incarceration to understand how these disturbing trends developed. As we said last week, quote, we have a good deal of unfinished business, unquote. So with that, let me turn the program over to the guy who spent almost 10 years studying the criminal justice system in Massachusetts, one of the best and hardworking researchers in the Commonwealth, Mass Inc.'s research director and director of the Gateway Cities Innovation Institute, Ben Foreman. Take it away, Ben.
Thank you very much, Craig. And I do have to say a thank you to John, a big thank you to John. Whenever I approach a new research project totally naive, I'm struck by how generous people are with their time. and bringing me along, but there's nobody that's been better than John. Year after year, I've come to him with questions, and he's always been there to thoughtfully walk me through the issues. And you can see here on my first slide, it looks at, we've explored criminal justice from so many different vantage points over the years. The coalition's work has always been about comprehensive reforms, and that means in every aspect of the system. While we've looked at rehabilitation in correctional facilities and rehabilitative programs, we've never actually looked at what it takes to do that work and what conditions are necessary, and how we prepare people for those roles. I think it's really timely that we come to that now, especially as our most recent research has focused on correctional spending. It led to the creation of a correctional expenditure commission that's right now looking at what resources we need our correctional facilities to have in order to do the job well. I think as Greg alluded to, it's important to set this work in the context of racial justice at the outset. I think one thing you'll realize as you read this new report, which will be on our website today, there's no way that we can run effective correctional facilities with the limited resources we have unless we eliminate racial disparities totally. We just cannot have the number of people we do, even with significant declines, in the highest cost settings, and still have resources to do the work well, still have resources to do diversion well, which is critically important, and still have resources to do reentry and all the investing we want to do in the communities that have been disproportionately affected by the legacy of tough on crime policies. So it's critical. You'll see here, I looked at these numbers from the census last summer, the most recent data we had, and you can see that the racial disparities in Massachusetts for Black residents is 5 times higher, 5.5 times higher incarceration rates, 4 times higher for Latinx residents. If we could eliminate those disparities, we could still cut our population by another half still. I think the other kind of lens to think about this work through is it's going to take us a while to get rid of all those persistent racial disparities. And to the extent that we have disproportionately incarcerated people of color in our correctional facilities, we better do everything in our power to make sure that's a therapeutic environment and not doing further harm to those individuals and their families. And there's a lot that can be done right away, and we need our correctional officers on the front lines to lead that effort. I think that's really important. We could just make this a focus on conditions of confinement and look at what happens within facilities. We've decided to make this a focus on the correctional officers doing the work for 2 reasons. One, in addition to being objective and nonpartisan, we pride ourselves on being practical. And I think it's foolhardy to think that correctional officers are going to fully buy in to the changes we're trying to make in their organizations if they only see it as a risk to their jobs and their collective bargaining power. But I think even more importantly, the literature, and there is a long literature here, shows that correctional officers are critical to doing this complex human service work, and they want to do it. Going back to pre-tough on crime era studies, to studies in the midst of tough on crime, to studies today, surveys consistently find correctional officers believe in rehabilitation as a goal for their work. And not only that, they believe they're the ones in their agencies who are in the best position to help the individuals in their care desist from crime upon release. When you look at the day-to-day in a good correctional facility, they're at the center of a treatment team, looking at the treatment protocol, understanding it, helping to observe whether it's working, helping to get the individual to comply with the treatment protocol, especially when it comes to recognizing criminal thinking and correcting thought distortions. I think when you look at the state of the practice today, it's very much focused on those criminogenic risks and needs and trying to reduce those before individuals come home. And the last part, coming home. More and more, we want to see community-based organizations build capacity and bring that capacity behind the walls. And that means they need strong partners in the correctional officers who are working with individuals and preparing them for reentry. So all of those things are really important. The field wants to do all that work, but we haven't put them in a position to do that, and largely to just simply space and physical constraints. As politically we decided to put more and more people behind bars and introduce them to the joys of busting rocks, there was no ability to provide programming safely. And as John said, we took the classrooms out, We double bunk people wherever we could find space. And that was the reality until just a few days ago, basically. You don't have to go back very far to find stories in the Globe of judges mandating superintendents to release inmates or prisoners because conditions were inhumane. And the field is still living with that relatively recent past. And there's a whole lot of literature that we go through in the report that talks about the particular strains that correctional officers endure and the consequences that those strains take on their health. Hopefully, many of those have been alleviated by the reduction in overcrowding, but others are still with us. In some ways, interact with reform. And I just want to bring focus to those. And one, I think we should acknowledge exposure to pathogens is a serious issue for correctional officers. Just before the pandemic, there was lots of concern about fentanyl and carfentanil and a powder posing a risk of life to correctional officers, and many left the field because they were so fearful of that. But the last two, role strain and organizational stress, there's a whole literature of when you ask people to be a guard and you ask someone to be a counselor, they're doing two things that are diametrically opposed. And if we don't build our correctional systems with a mission and a clear, explicit focus that we want you to do both of those things, we value both of those things, and we put you in an environment where you're able to do both of those things, it's going to put people in an inordinate amount of stress. And that gets to the organizational stressors. I think any of us have difficulty managing change within our organization and our job, especially when we don't have voice to influence that change. But it's particularly problematic when you're in an environment where change can have life or death implications for you. So I think as we think about how we work towards change, from a labor management perspective, there's probably no organization where it's more important to have labor front and center as we work together toward common goals. Again, on the right-hand side of this chart, there's a long literature talking about how, from an occupational perspective, correctional officers endure more and are in worse health as a result of it than any other field. PTSD, for example, is found to be elevated well above levels of active duty military personnel. Again, some of that relates to things that hopefully we are beyond, but all you have to do is read some of the most recent stuff from Northeastern University, who looked at suicide in the Department of Correction and found it was 4 times higher than others in high-risk categories nationally, or the U.S. Attorney's complaint on the Department of Correction and mental health services, to realize that the conditions today, while they may not be overcrowded, there are still many things that are happening that are deeply alarming and injurious to correctional officer health that we need to change. We've had the opportunity to change because the population is declining. A lot of that is due to corrections, criminal justice reform, sentencing reform, but not all of it. I think we should appreciate that some of it comes, as an act of God almost, the crime lab scandals that led to cases dismissed, thousands of them, and now the pandemic. It has brought us nearer to the levels of pre-tough on crime era, but not all the way there, and we've got further work to do. And we can't let them start to climb again once we get past the pandemic. And this chart just shows that. It looks at the change in incarceration rate in Massachusetts, the state and county level, and compares it to the decline in crime, both property and violent crime. And you can see, based on 1990 levels, prior to the pandemic, we weren't quite there at the county level. We were below it in the DOC incarceration rate, but not compared to as far as crime has dropped. And again, this is based on the available data. It sets us back to 1990. I think, as you'll hear today, the tough on crime policies really began to take hold in the early 80s. So we've got further to go. From a staffing perspective, I think that's something that will be very much a topic of conversation. Our population has fallen much faster than the staff, and that's led to lower ratios. It's important to interpret these ratios. They're not like student to teacher ratios when they're all in the building together at the same time. Obviously, we have multiple shifts. We have people on vacation, and individuals are in these facilities 24/7. But the point here is that we've, just like we've reduced the population by half, we've reduced the staff ratios over the last decade by half, giving correctional officers much greater ability to work one-on-one with those who are in their care. So again, this paper just poses this all as an opportunity. We've got work to do to further reduce our populations, but we're on the way there. As we get to these lower levels, can we build facilities that look and act and function much more therapeutically, that are healthier for the people that work in them as well? The picture here in the background is from a young adult unit. And a lot of this conversation and what led us to do this work is the early experience in the young adult units, where we're functioning and acting very differently, we're getting better outcomes, and the people who are doing that work, the correctional officers themselves, find it to be transformational. So how do we further that? How do we make that more of what it looks like throughout our system, especially as hopefully there's far fewer young adults in the population? We've got a bunch of recommendations in the report. I'll just very quickly share a few. One is this issue of minimum staffing levels. How do we make sure we're safely staffing our facilities and not relying on judges to determine that in the future? The Correctional Expenditure Commission is working with the National Institute of Corrections to review all facilities and look at their staffing needs. I think we got to make sure that's a rigorous, robust, and transparent process, because that should be our baseline going forward. Hopefully after that, we'll see that there is more staff than positions to fill, and we've got some flexibility to work with. We should use some of that flexibility to provide correctional officers opportunity to come out from behind the walls and to work in the community, to get to understand the community better, to develop those relations with the community-based organizations, to lend them some capacity, and also just to simply distress. There's a lot of literature that suggests that rotations help correctional officers distress and increase their retention, which reduces costs overall. Right now, when you look at correctional officer contracts, there's very little educational incentive pay. That was based on years ago when studies found you didn't need highly trained officers to do the work of guards. When we're talking about complex human services work and the science today, and as advanced as it is, it's important to provide incentives in the training, which is the next budget there, looking at training and employee wellness. We've argued again and again, we should set aside funds in the budget to pay for programs. We should equally be clear about setting aside funds to provide high quality training and employee wellness programs, making sure that there aren't great disparities in the ability of officers to take advantage of that when we move from agency to agency, county to county. The Corrections Master Plan is the document we actually began our research with in 2012 for the 2013 report, because it was calling for continued growth in the state's population and the need to build several additional facilities. That's no longer the case. We've seen a dramatic drop, thankfully, but a recent report from DCAM found that of the facilities we have, many of them need to be replaced. Others need total renovations. They expect $700 million in capital costs over the next decade. We better figure out what are the facilities we need, what do they need to look like, how are they healthy, therapeutic environments. Correctional officers are actually probably better adept and knowledgeable to provide us with that kind of information than anybody else. So I think it's imperative to get that process going and to make sure that they're involved in the work. And lastly, surveying correctional officers. We survey our teachers regularly to understand what the field's experiencing, and it gives us incredible insight. And we should be doing the same with correctional officers. It's very hard to know what goes on behind the walls in every facility, but one easy way to find out, to generate learning and provide accountability, frankly, is to undertake a rigorous and regular survey process. So that's it. Again, the report will be on our website today. We encourage everybody to read it. We hope it's the beginning of a conversation, and we look forward to starting that now. And I'll turn it back over to Greg to introduce the next segment of our convening. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ben. As usual, great job. Okay, now I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's panel, Sarah Betancourt. Sarah is a reporter with Commonwealth Magazine, and prior to joining Commonwealth, she was a reporter for the Associated Press in Boston and a correspondent with the Boston Globe and the Guardian. As many of you know, Sarah has done an amazing job covering many criminal justice matters, including state and county corrections, ICE, and immigration. Sarah, thanks for being here today. I'll turn it over to you to introduce the panel.
Thank you so much, Greg, and Ben as well for that excellent presentation. And thank you to everyone who is listening in on this conversation about funds in the criminal justice system. We're going to talk for the next 45 minutes or so about how public safety expenditures in prisons and jails have evolved. We'll also talk about how changes and reallocation of resources can help heal the ongoing scars left by the tough on crime era policies disproportionately impacting Black and Brown communities. It is such a rare thing when we get to hear from people who work in or have experience as correctional staff, particularly as tensions surge over how the criminal justice system needs to urgently evolve in Massachusetts. So for that, we're grateful. Thank you to our panelists for joining this discussion. We're going to hear from Brian Daw, a co-founder of the Massachusetts Correctional Officers Federated Union, the current national director of One Voice United. We'll hear from Yolanda Smith, the superintendent of the Suffolk County Sheriff's Department. She began her career as a correctional officer at the House of Correction there. She currently oversees a population of 1,800 people and a staff of more than 500 COs. Senator Gomez of Springfield shares an important viewpoint as someone who was involved with the justice system and has said reform is of significant interest to him. The senator will have to leave a little early to join session. Welcome to everyone. I ask that everyone keep it short and try to address the questions specifically so we don't veer too far off course. All right, well, in that case, Brian, let's jump in with you. Having seen Ben's presentation and having had such a long career in corrections and being a vocal proponent of COs, what are two of the biggest issues you see as needing to be resolved around corrections funding?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you very much for this opportunity. It's rare to have our voices heard in such a great forum, so we do greatly appreciate that. And relative to Ben's policy recommendations, I think they're terrific. I think two of the biggest problems we have right now, probably the biggest problem that we face is staff wellness and inmate wellness, offender wellness, mental health issues. I think those are one of the key areas that we really need to focus on as we move forward with our reform movement. There's been a lot of changes over corrections through the years that I've been here. When I started in 1982, it was me and 44 inmates at MCI Norfolk at the housing unit, Unit 4-3. When I left the housing unit for a union position in 1990, only 8 years later, it was me and 66 inmates. So the population grew dramatically during the drug wars. And as we now turn the other page and we see this reduction, we have to make sure that what we do is that we don't decrease the staff to the point where we cannot have the programming we need, because you're seeing the decrease in the offender population, and that's a really good sign for all of us that work and live behind the walls and for the citizens of the country. But we can't lose sight of the fact that as we decrease this inmate population, if we're going to make the reforms we need the staff there to make sure that programming is a possibility, that rehabilitation is in the forefront, that we have interaction with the inmates, which we have been moved out of since the 1980s and 90s. Like when I started, I was involved in disciplinary hearings. I was involved in classification hearings. I would write recommendations for parole, offender evaluations. All of that was taken away when they brought in unit management. They moved us out of that. The officers need to be directly involved if this program and reforms to take place and move forward. So I think the two most major things is addressing officer wellness and inmate wellness, offender wellness. And I think the other issue is making sure that we properly staff our facilities to make sure that the reforms we're looking to do and to make sure that we can incorporate in the criminal justice system, that those are done. The one thing I would disagree with Mr. Foreman on before I move off, when he said that a lot of the stresses have been really, reduced because of the decrease in inmate population. Well, study after study after study shows that 60% of our stress comes from the administration. Only 15% comes from the inmates.
And thank you so much, Brian. We're going to get to the stress conversation later. Senator Gomez, you're new to the legislature, but have unique experience in seeing the justice system firsthand. Can you talk briefly about your experience and how it shaped you, or it has shaped you so far as a legislator? And can you pick just one issue that you really intend to drill in on?
Thank you, Matt Sank and Sarah. Thank you for that question. Uh, Very briefly, I was a part of the criminal justice system at 17 years old when I was charged with the mandatory minimum, and I was charged as an adult. From there, trying to navigate the different programs and trying to get myself back on track. Obviously, there was plenty of programs in the community, and staying on track, staying in school, then getting involved with advocacy organizations in Hampden County, such as Neighbor to Neighbor, catapulted me to pushing this criminal justice reform from 2017, which in 2015 I was elected to the Springfield City Council, and just so recently I was elected to the Massachusetts State Senate in 2020. I apologize. And at the moment right now, when it comes to criminal justice reform, I'm really looking to push more on advocacy on, programming inside of the incarceration institutes, and also expungements of different records. We still have, regardless, a high volume of disproportionate, even though prisoners are being more released. I think that we're at a position that, when we have those conversations on the buzzwords of defund the police, we as a community really just want to refund the community and absolutely make sure that we are trying to work on the recidivism that is happening, because honestly, we love the programs in the community. We respect the programs. We know that there's a lot of different things, but getting people back to work and creating jobs is paramount and number one on my agenda.
Well, thank you, Senator. And we're definitely going to get to discussions about programming and behavioral health later in the discussion. I do want to get to the superintendent as well. Superintendent, you've been on the ground on the county level for so many years. And we often talk about the differences between the DOC and the county perspective. What can you offer in regards to a lens into what the challenges are on the county perspective? Maybe just talking about one or two challenges.
I think the major challenge for us has been funding. And I think this is probably true of all correctional facilities, but more specifically for county corrections, we have become the de facto mental health and substance abuse facilities, in addition to education, employment skills, all of these things that we need to transfer and teach our men and women. So it does come with a cost. And we have been extremely lucky to have partners and stakeholders who bring their resources to us. But for as long as I've been in administration, I've always known that we were going to have to appeal for a supplemental budget just to get the things done that we want to get done to help our men and women put tools on their belt. So I think that's been quite frustrating, but we do our best to make sure that we bring in partners and volunteers and contractors who are going to make the difference that we all want to see.
Okay. So just jumping off of that point, and this is for both Brian and the superintendent, the number of people incarcerated, and we've gotten this question in the chat, the number of people incarcerated by the state and counties has fallen over the years, which Ben mentioned, although staffing reductions haven't been quite as steep as the decline in the prisoner population. But at the same time, salaries of correctional officers have gone up 20 to 32% from 2011 salary levels for the county and the DOC respectively. Why is that? And how do you balance that with the calls for putting more money toward prisoners and planning your budgets? And either of you can start.
Superintendent, please.
Okay, so I want to say that our correction officers, we hire them and we look for them to have an invested role in social justice and change and really be an intricate part of helping these folks rehabilitate. And so with that, this is a thankless job. They do an amazing job at what they do. And they deserve, admittedly, like any other corporation, I believe, any other agency, to receive cost of living wages, cost of living increases in their wages. And I know that people say that we should have fewer officers, but specifically in Boston, I have people who are remanded to custody, and so many of them are a part of street gangs. So our keep separates are so big, so different than maybe some of the smaller agencies. And so that requires staff. We don't want anyone to get hurt. We don't want to have less than the staff we need here, which would cause everything to be bad. The enemies would hurt each other, and our staff would get hurt. And so I just hope that when people think about or opine that too much money is going into salary, that they understand that there's so many moving parts behind the wall. And the end result for us is that everybody is safe, everybody is programmatic and doing things that are going to make them better when they leave. And correction officers play a huge role in all of that.
2 points. First, one of the things Massachusetts has done a terrible job on is pay parity. I was a state correctional officer, but I can tell you right now, the county correctional officers, I defy any state legislator to go to one of our county facilities on a Friday or Saturday night and tell me that's not the toughest job in corrections. So that's number one. Pay parity should be brought up. Number two, if you want quality people and you want people to work in an incarceration system where we're trying to help people, rehabilitate people, and bring them back into society, you need quality people. You need people who are going to spend a career in corrections, and you're not going to get people to spend a career in corrections for $28,000 a year. You pay pennies, you get monkeys. You need good people inside corrections. You need people to be professionally, to be well-trained, to be well-paid, to stay on the job. When you have a high turnover rate, you have a green officer staff, you have problems in your facility. So it's imperative not only from the standpoint that what is just for the officers, but it's also for the success of the system that you bring in quality people and you can retain them.
So it sounds like boosting staffing levels despite declining populations is of interest to you. Now, keeping in mind cost of living increases tending to be for most professions being about 3 to 4%, how do you justify such a significant increase of salaries? And instead of like just keeping salaries at a moderate level and hiring more COs, like what's the reasoning around that?
I'm not sure what you mean by such an increased high salary. What do you
the 20 to 32% increase from 2011 salary levels?
From 2011, you're talking 10 years ago. So what are you looking at, 2%, 3% a year?
Does there tend to be a 3% increase for union contracts every year? Because those tend to be negotiated every few years.
It's usually in Massachusetts, usually every 3 years that they're negotiated. A 2 to 3% increase every year over 10 years, to me, is not at all a high increase. In fact, in some states that would be considered low. We're not the highest paid correctional officers in the country. Well, Massachusetts isn't.
Superintendent, do you have any thoughts?
I actually agree with Brian. I feel like that is over the span of 10 years that's appropriate. Again, I go back to what the job entails and how much stress comes along with it, and how hard it is to keep correction officers in place. And I don't want to spiral into another conversation, but I will say this in brevity. We train our officers, and shortly after that, different law enforcement, i.e. police, municipalities come knocking at the door, and they take them. So we are constantly trying to keep up. We are constantly trying to keep our salaries comparable to other law enforcement municipalities, so that people, in addition to investing in social justice, want to make this a career.
So, as a reporter, it's really rare to get this level of insight into thinking for corrections, and it's quite helpful. Often you see prison advocates having press conference weekly, but we don't really see that from the correctional officers unions. And there's a lot of instances where you have these bills from legislators who are sympathetic toward prison advocates, and then the DOC and unions say they weren't consulted with. And that's about the extent that they tell reporters. For example, you have Brownsberger's bill to eliminate the cost of prison phone calls that has garnered blowback from COs who say they just weren't talked to. Commonwealth actually spent a year trying to get information from each county concerning what they do with funds from private communication companies and surveyed each saying, what do you think about Brownsberger's bill? What keeps individuals from yourselves from holding pressers on these issues like advocate groups? And wouldn't greater transparency in what funds are used for actually potentially even boost your funding or direct the way we look at public policy? And this is for all three of you.
Sarah, I would say that I believe that we are very transparent. It would be amazing if we did not have to charge a fee for phone calls and video visits. But we do, and that money, 100% of that money goes back into programming and services that the men and women need, and as a result of not getting funded for those programs and services. So again, that 100% of that money goes, and I don't think that people want to hear that. We send out press releases all the time. We will go to the State House and talk about it, and tell anyone and show folks that money is for the betterment of the men and women, 100%. And that talks about special ed programs, vocational track, things that they're going to need, like I said, and I can't say it enough, to go back into the communities in which we all live in and try to hold their own in society.
I look at it in a perspective that traditionally myself, using core links, using the JPays, paying to stay in contact with our loved ones, Hampden County, where I live, and I can only speak in that perspective, is the most arrested county in the state of Massachusetts. Obviously, no slate intended, but we understand that, being a correctional officer is a very stressful job, just like being a police officer. Being in that industry is no piece of cake. But when you have the most impoverished county, where some individuals, they have to figure out if they can take this call or not take a call and stay connected with their loved ones, if they're locked up in county or if they're upstate, really sometimes becomes a burden. And it depends on the administration, right? If the administration is being super transparent, like you said, your office is being transparent as much as possible. I know exactly, your administration is a fantastic administration. I have family members that are correctional officers right now that work with the LED division and also here in Hampden County. But, I think to put in perspective what exactly is going on, entirely, and looking at the money and how we can reinvest it in certain ways to make sure that it's actually reaching that population. And it's not to put in question the integrity of anyone. It's just to really make sure that we absolutely understand what's the percentage on what's going to the different programs that you guys are creating. I think that's where, and I can't speak on behalf of Senator Brownsberger, but for the most part, it's a conversation that obviously my office and myself are willing to have to understand, okay, how much money is coming in specific when it comes to that type of industry, when it comes to communication, and how much are we charging? And then from there, how is the percentages broken down? And in which way and adequately is it going to Black and brown prisoners? And that's just a little bit that I wanted to just add into that, just a little perspective.
So I think all three of you talked about a really important thing, programming. And, I think we can all agree that programming leads to better outcomes in many situations. and funding of programming for county and the DOC can be pretty difficult. Can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges that both you and Brian, superintendent, have faced over your career, just seeing the goals that you have in programming and what you're actually able to do? Because I know sometimes we have these aspirations that we can't quite reach because the money's not there.
I can be really quick on this one because we pushed right out of the programming situation. We're not asked to be involved. We're not asked our opinion on it. We've been pretty much reduced to gatekeepers. Is pretty much where we're at in the situation relative to program goes. I can tell you that a lot of the things did change over the years in corrections. While I was there as a result of lack of funding, we lost roll call. They took officers out of the towers, those types of things. But as far as programming goes, we've never been involved in that. They don't involve us in it, which is something they absolutely should do. One last point on the transparency thing that was just brought up. We are 100% behind transparency, but not just economics. We want it all open up. We want transparency on staffing ratios, on training, on everything that's going on there, recidivism rates. We want to know what's going on. We think one of the biggest problems in corrections today is the lack of transparency.
And I guess who's the guard keeper of those numbers? Who would be able to improve better transparency? Is it the legislature? Is it the DOC or EOPS?
It's the legislature. Tie funding into data collection and data release. That's the fastest way to do it. And make them show us what's going on. We don't even know what's working and what isn't because we don't have the numbers to back up anything.
Yolanda or Superintendent?
Yeah, thank you. I would say that now is a time for us to reimagine corrections. And I think we're doing just that. We too have an example of that, Sarah. We have a peace unit, which is for our young offenders. And we knew that was going to be a huge undertaking and a culture change for the population. So to Brian's point, we didn't want to do this without the union and the body's input. So we went in vans to Connecticut. We sat around the tables and talked about how we would develop this program. So I think it is very key to including our staff, and I mean from any rank, union members, come to the table. We want that, so that folks have more to say about what we're doing. And to Ben's point, we want our officers to invest in what we're doing. And the only way they can do that is they have to know about it and they have to have some say. So inclusion is super important to us. And I think that is what's going to help us reimagine what corrections should look like. I mean, we're doing graduations for folks, and inclusive of caps and gowns and pomp and circumstance and families coming in. That wouldn't happen if we did not sit down with the officers and explain that and have them give us input, because they're the ones with boots on the ground, and we need that. So I think that as we continue to reimagine corrections, and that's exactly what's happening right now, especially since the pandemic has been a game changer, we've learned to adjust, and we've learned that especially in the pandemic, it was the unknown. We were all in this bubble together. Officers, men and women remanded to custody. We were all administrators, all in it together, trying to keep people safe, keep people alive, and provide some sense of normalcy during the entire thing. So I definitely think that the entire buy-in has to come from everybody on all levels.
Thank you, Superintendent. Now, I know the Senator has to leave in a couple of minutes, but I did want to ask if, Senator, if you have any thoughts on programming and also how things are rolling out during the pandemic in regards to reforming corrections and funding.
At the moment, when it comes to recovery, that's one of the things that I think that all of us are reimagining, to be totally honest. We know that individuals that have been having difficulties with reintegrating and trying to find, places where they can go, specifically during with trying to control the spread and stop the spread of this virus. I know that when it comes to programming, we have to figure out a way to, like I said, reinvest into this community, reinvest into job creations, but create jobs that individuals are going to hire returning citizens. We have to figure out to make sure that when they are released, that once they're released, that they're, if it's on a regimen of medication that they're on, that they make sure that they're not waiting 3 or 90 days, 3 months to 90 days to figure out if they can see their doctor. Because once they're in custody under the superintendent, I think that we're at a point that sometimes when they're released, it takes so long for them to get back on track because they're in a system of rehabilitation that once they're released back into the community, it's hard for individuals to get back on track. And there's such a time frame that very quickly they can really jump off track. But for the most part, I know that, early on, I'm going to be communicating with legislatures, having an open door policy, working with our county sheriff here, Nick Kochi, and really opening the door to really have these conversations, because I think it's really important, like Brian had stated, the transparency piece, to understand both sides of the coin, to really understand that where, at what point, where does the buck stop? Is it at the state legislature? Is that at the administration? Or is it, something that they need and they need more support of? Obviously, when it comes to parity, when we're talking about, the percentage of raises and money, for many, many years, we know that wages have been stagnated. The cost of living is going up. And the industry itself, it seems that it's very, very top heavy. But I think during this session, this is something that I think the legislature is going to be communicating with, and hopefully that we can have more of a transparent approach to bring in correctional officers and also the administrations to help mitigate this and make sure that the policies that we do push forward are going to make sure that these individuals that are returning to our communities thrive.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for joining us.
I
So,
really appreciate it.
of course, Brian and Superintendent, I do want to go back to programming and really drill in on a couple of things. One, how it's going during the pandemic, but also what are the specific funding issues for programming and what are some solutions? Like, for instance, one of the interesting things I found out in the prison phone calls investigation was that many counties were actually using those funds to hire behavioral health counselors and expand programming around culinary arts. What kind of funding sources do you look for, and what solutions are you looking for in regards to both behavioral health and programming?
Well, for me, the behavioral health and programming is two-pronged. It's not just with the offender population. It's also with all the staff. If we're going to actually address the mental health issues that we have inside corrections today, then what we really have to do is address the holistic approach, take a holistic approach to everybody involved in this scenario, starting with our administrators, training them in transformational leadership, and removing part of the paramilitary stuff that we have to deal with that causes a lot of the internal problems. For the offender population and the staff, the day-to-day staff, and we need to look at emotional intelligence training so that we can decrease the stress levels and increase programming. One of the biggest problems with programming is we don't have the staff to do it, especially during the pandemics when we've had so many people out with COVID, mandatory overtime, and the rest. We don't have the staff or the ability to do it. We need the staffing to make sure that those programs go off, and they need to be funded properly. We really need to take a look at what we're doing here and what we want the end result to be, because we seem to have lost that. And I guess those would be my 2 points on that.
Superintendent? You're on mute.
I am sorry about that. I think during this pandemic, like I mentioned before, it has truly been a game changer on how we comport business as it pertains to delivering programs and services. And I think that during the pandemic, we learned that we had to rely on technology. A lot of what we needed to bring up to the 21st century. And so I will not name the partners, but we've had a couple partners who said that we want to continue to deliver these services as much as you all do. So we became very familiar with Zoom, much like what we're doing today, and trying to be innovative as to how we bring these programs. I think in the beginning of the pandemic, I will say, and I probably speak for a lot of counties and maybe even DOC, the first thing that we were concerned with was preservation of life and understanding this global pandemic. But as we learned more and learned how to protect ourselves, it was paramount to bring back staff. And then when we surged again, we had to slow it down. But again, I go back to the technology. That is what has helped us continue to deliver programs and services so that our men and women aren't just idle. Because I believe when they're busy, when the men and women are busy and working on their betterment, it's an easier job for correction officers. And so it has been a struggle. And prior to the pandemic, again, we've always been underfunded. So we're very reliant on grants and on our stakeholders and partners who bring their resources to us. I believe that we do a lot of surveying and we do individual service plans with the men and women so that we can understand what the need looks like. We try to treat everybody individually so that we can provide them services that they're going to need holistically, that they're going to need. So again, so that when they go back into my community, your community, they're better.
I would like to add something to that too. As it relates to, I'm sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry, I'll hold off. I'll wait till later.
All right, so let's talk about job stress. I know you both have mentioned that for COs, and I know in particular during the pandemic, that must be pretty significant. Can you briefly just talk about what kind of stressors COs have during the pandemic?
Well, it's not just during the pandemic, but the pandemic has certainly added a great deal to the problem for sure. And we have officers around the country that are sleeping in RVs because they won't go into their homes. We have officers, excuse me, scared to death to even be with their children because of what they could bring home. The stress is already, we have a PTSD rate that's 34%. It's double what the police is. Our suicide rate is through the ceiling. And when you add these additional problems onto it, you can't have communication with your family, with your children. You're in a confined environment with a disease that's running rampant, that's not just injuring people, it's killing people. The stresses are just phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal right now. It couldn't be worse.
I will echo what Brian has said and just add that, I was a correction officer and I just moved through the ranks, but I can remember the stressors that I faced every day. Did I do was my count good enough? Did I ensure that everybody was breathing? Considering and knowing that so many people come to us with substance use disorders and with mental health and in mental health crisis, and sometimes dual diagnosed. Am I doing enough for them? Am I keeping everyone safe? That's a huge stressor. It's a big responsibility to provide care, custody, and control to a group of people who sometimes come to us very broken. And so that's a lot of stress in and of itself. Add a pandemic that we didn't know much about. And to Brian's point, I had officers who told me that they had to get hotels, they slept in their cars because they were working with the population. And we were all learning how to adjust and how to keep ourselves safe and learning best practices during this pandemic. So there is so much stress to what we do, all while trying to keep so many different populations calm and trying to allow innovative ways for them to reach out to their families to let them know that they're okay. I mean, so the stresses just keep piling and piling and piling. And these officers have an expectation, as we have been mentioning, to make sure that the folks who are remanded to custody are safe and are safe and doing as best they can possibly do.
We also had a lot of problems with mandatory overtime as a result of this. And when you don't have the programmings and you don't have the visitation and you have all that idle time, it gets nasty in there. And you can understand why. They're locked down basically 23, 24 hours a day. There's no respite for anybody, staff or the offenders. That makes it extremely, extremely volatile. Very difficult for everybody.
And throw inclement weather in there too. on top of the pandemic was just a bad recipe. But I mean, this is an opportunity for me to speak about the correction officers. They work through it. We do what we have to do the job, make sure people are fine and are getting their needs met through all of it. And so I would be remiss if I did not say that, because it's a thankless job and they really work hard and with all those stressors that we both highlighted today.
That's
So
why we're dead
one
at
of the
50.
many things that, I mean, it's so difficult to get tools for COs to deal with a pandemic, but one of the things that the state has been able to prioritize is vaccines for correctional officers, for staff, contractors, and also prisoners on both the county level and the state level. It's been pretty widely reported in the past couple of days that about 50% of correctional officers are refusing a vaccine. I guess, what's your insight toward that? And I mean, is that figure a little different on the county side? And why refuse such a valuable tool to stay safe for your family and for also the prisoners?
I'm at a loss, to be quite honest with you. When I get this question from people, should I take the vaccine? My first response is, I don't listen to conspiracy theories. I don't listen to the internet. I listen to my physician. My physician says, take the vaccine. I take the vaccine. I recommend all officers do the same. But as to why they aren't doing it, I think a lot of it is misinformation, which is what we've been dealing with incredibly around the country on a lot of issues. But I think that's one of the biggest ones.
Yes, I agree with everything Brian just said. And I think one of the biggest problems we have is earned mistrust. Black and brown officers are afraid to take the vaccine, as are many Black and brown men and women remanded to custody. They are afraid to take the vaccine, and it's earned mistrust, and it becomes our job to educate ourselves and bring in stakeholders, i.e. doctors and community partners who are going to have town forums in our facilities to say, ask me anything about the vaccination. And that has proven to be super important to getting people to vaccine. But until we break down the phobia barriers, until we make people understand, or not make them, but help them understand that this vaccine is going to help them, and people, Black and brown people, work toward the vaccine. We're a big part of developing the vaccine. I think we're going to be at a stall. So it's super important to never stop educating people and bringing in community partners. Just recently, I think it was last week, we did an Ask Me Anything forum. We had some of our partners from Harvard University there, as well as Dr. Worsell from Tufts come and be a part of this panel, and a doctor from Brigham and Women's, saying, ask me anything. And Sarah, Brian, you all would be amazed at some of the questions that were asked. The most touching question with me that I took home that night, and I'll say it in brevity, is one of because we did a survey and we front loaded the questions so that we would have them in case they were shy to ask. One of the questions was, I get it why you all want to put us in phase 1 so that you can test the vaccine more. So it took us a lot of time to make them understand that, and this was from the inmate population, that the vaccines they were receiving, I could have easily gotten mine from the same vial because I was in phase 1, because I work in a congregate environment. So I think some of the biggest obstacles is mistrust and fear, and passed on fear. And we even showed a video of the Tuskegee experiment and some of the family members of the folks who were engaged in the Tuskegee Institute to beg people to just learn about the vaccine and make an informed decision, and not just rely on fear and phobias and past experiences of others.
So I know we might be running a little over time, but I do want to get 2 final questions in, because I think you both made incredible points. I guess my follow-up question would be, do you think vaccines should be mandatory for COs, or is that something that should be left to their discretion when they're working in these congregate settings that have had outbreaks?
I think you'd have a hard time making it mandatory.
Yeah, I will admittedly say I wish everyone would protect themselves and their families and all of us. But right now, I don't see that it's going to be made mandatory. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that the vaccine is not FDA approved. It was given emergency use. So I think that we would have a hard time making it mandatory. But I look forward to the day that it is, because I just look forward to life preservation.
Okay. And so both of you have mentioned throughout all of this some long-term solutions that you think would be good for refunding corrections. And then, as always with the pandemic, you have to think of short-term solutions. Like I mentioned, short on time, but we do have a really good question from the audience around solutions. I know we could go all day about this, and I would truly love to do another one of these. So on outcomes, which is like the best way to really measure how the criminal justice system is doing, corrections mandates often focus on keeping those in custody safe and getting them ready for release and successful return to community. How do we measure those outcomes? And I mean, how do we measure those outcomes in a pandemic as well?
I promise I'll be super brief. I think that we continue to make sure that the programs in which we are delivering are evidence-based. I think that it's our responsibility to produce very good recidivism studies and just really be a part of the table in the community with legislators as we continue to make decisions for people who are remanded to custody.
I think one of the things we need to be concerned about is the level of stress within inside the institutions, and we should be measuring that to see how we're adjusting and what programs are working and what isn't working, not just with the staff, but with the offender population as well. If our PTSD is 34%, I can only imagine what the offender population must be like, and combining the two is an incredibly volatile mix. If you can see that reduced, if you can see dignity assaults reduced, if you can see the utilization of solitary reduced, if you can see your recidivism rates increase, becoming better, now you've got some metrics from which to go what's working and what isn't working.
Okay.
And it seems like you're very interested in metrics, Brian. How are COs, and this is another question from the audience, how are COs held accountable for outcomes, and is data a part of that at all? Or is someone else responsible for this?
Well, COs are responsible for the public safety outcome. We're not responsible for the programming outcome. We're not allowed even in most of those conversations in most facilities. So our responsibility lies in our protocols. Our protocols are public safety, staff safety, inmate safety, and officer safety. Everything else, everything happens after that. So those are where our protocols are right now. But the metrics, to me, I think there's, for years until the Patriot Act came in, departments of corrections routinely reported to the corrections yearbook a lot of the metrics we need to see what works and what isn't. After the Patriot Act came in, they stopped doing that. That's become very difficult to find out what works and what doesn't.
Superintendent?
I go back to making sure that we collect data and making sure that we do every 3 years or so do recidivism studies that are going to help us measure our success or not. And Brian mentioned it very earlier on. We're not really data collection is not incorporated in our funding. So we have to think of innovative ways to get that done, which stalls the process. So it would be extremely helpful if we could allot monies toward data collection and data sharing.
Now, a lot of funding is tied to the state budget, but also there is this overhanging question of the 2018 criminal justice reform package. Was anything in there specific to funding? And if so, what has the outcome been like in the past couple of years? And what would you like to see resolved?
For me, it's very simple. There were a lot of mandates that we're being held to, and I honestly think it's a good thing. But I just think we needed to be supported financially to get it done.
Yeah, you can't expect outcomes without the funding. Otherwise it just becomes talk, just platitudes. And I think, unfortunately, as we head towards what looks like we're going to be facing an economic downturn, as much as we want to see reforms, and believe me, correctional officers want to see reforms more than anybody next to the offender population itself. As we see these things happening, as we see the economy shrinking, I fear that the reforms that we really need the most are going to get put to the wayside for quite a while longer.
Okay. Well, I appreciate both of you diving in so deeply and being so specific on some of these questions. It looks like we have to wrap up, but I think this has been an enlightening and eye-opening conversation. And we do really appreciate the insight and the look towards solutions. Greg, I am gonna hand it back to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Sorry about the pause there, folks. Thank you guys so much for that that tremendous discussion. I've always thought that one of the biggest barriers to reform when it comes to conditions of confinement for both the population and the workforce is the sort of, call it the out of sight, out of mind problem. The issues that are dealt with behind the walls are incredibly complex, as you all brought out today. And solving some of those challenges is difficult. And if we don't really know that much about them, because most of us, most of the general public, most of the public officials rarely go behind the walls, it's really incumbent on us, and Brian was talking about this before we started the panel earlier in the hold room, it's really incumbent on all of us to get the message out about these issues and what's at stake here. And I really think you guys this morning got us down the road on that path. I hope we can do more of this, because I really do think it's important, very important. So thank you. Thank you for spending the time with us. And Sarah, thanks for doing such a great job moderating that panel. Okay, so now for closing remarks, I'm delighted to introduce Segun Idowu, the Executive Director of the Black Economic Council of Massachusetts. In his role as Executive Director, he advocates for policies that benefit Black businesses and residents in Massachusetts. Segun, welcome, and please give us your take on some of the issues that we've been discussing today.
Well, good morning to everyone, and I'd like to thank you, Greg, for the warm introduction, and Lauren and Juana and Ben and Meredith and Ashley and Caroline and everybody at MassInc for the invitation to share a few closing thoughts with everybody today. And I'd also like to thank Shira and Sarah for leading these two extraordinary, thought-provoking conversations, and all the panelists and speakers who stirred our hearts and expanded our perspectives and nurtured our souls with their insights and their experiences and their genius. So I was told that I have 5 minutes. And if we've learned anything from these two events, it's that 5 minutes can make all the difference. In 5 minutes, a Black or brown couple can be denied a home loan, undercutting their ability to create wealth for their children and generations to come. In 5 minutes, an employer can review a job application, look at the name or neighborhood, and place that resume in a file that will never be accessed again, leaving that Black or brown youth in an unemployment line that is double the size of their white counterpart. In 5 minutes, a drug deal meant to earn that unemployed potential food for their family, clothes for their body, heat and water for their household, can turn into a drug bust and land them in a concrete box with steel bars. In 5 minutes, poor representation and the biases of a judge can place that individual in a warehouse for a length of time not commensurate with the action or comparable to other communities. So what a difference 5 minutes can make. Now, all of you here may ask yourself, why is the head of the Black Economic Council of Massachusetts speaking at an event about criminal justice? It's because this issue is all about dollars and cents. Who owns and controls the dollar, and who has the sense to place it where it is needed the most? As an organization committed to addressing the racial wealth gap, to transforming that $8 in median net worth for Black families into $500,000 one day, as an organization that represents the 2,000 Black firms who employ 14,000 Massachusetts residents and contribute $1 billion or more to the state economy, our push is to help Black residents across the Commonwealth build, create, and sustain wealth for themselves and for each other through entrepreneurship and business development. That's why at an event like this today, I consider what we do as a society when our mothers or fathers, when our sisters or brothers, when our cousins or classmates, when our best friend from childhood return home. Often when our family and community members return to us, they face more hardships than when they went inside. In addition to their Black skin that marks them and the Black eye that the system gives them, they return with a Black X that follows them for the rest of their life. And though the focus for reentry, as Senator Gomez alluded to a little while ago, has been in connecting people simply to jobs, we realize it is not just about any job, but employment that respects the dignity of the human personality, that enhances one's capacity to become a more valuable member of their community, that affords one a wage that allows that person to provide for their families and for themselves. As an organization, we will seek to do this by helping those who are returning home create their own businesses, where they will not need to place a Black X in a black box that limits their life to those 5 minutes, but rather place a Black X in a black box in an LLC filing, or on a loan application, or on a paycheck for themselves and for their employees. This is another area worthy of investment if we are to not only reduce the rates of recidivism, but to disrupt the cycle of poverty that leads to incarceration to begin with. At a time when the Black business community is suffering, when 11% of our businesses have already closed due to COVID-19, we must do all we can to transform ideas into opportunities, no matter who they come from or the circumstances that person is in, because the health of the state's economy is predicated on the health of the Black economy. We've all heard the statistics throughout these 2 events, so I don't need to repeat them. We've all heard the stories, so I don't need to share them. Now, it is up to us to move towards substantive and sustainable solutions. The proverb tells us that if you want 1 year of prosperity, grow grain. If you want 10 years of prosperity, grow trees. But if you want 100 years of prosperity, grow people. And so let us all move in the direction of enacting policies, of making investments that grow people, so that we can ensure the prosperity of our communities, of our cities, and of the Commonwealth for generations to come. I thank you all again, Greg and the team at Mass Inc. for this time, and I look forward to building this new and better world with all of you in the days, weeks, and months ahead. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. That was truly wonderful. Really appreciate you spending the time with us this morning. So look, I want to thank everybody that's been involved in this year's summit. Thanks to once again to our sponsors, the Shaw Foundation, Boston Foundation, Community Resources for Justice, and Al Caneb. Thanks to everybody who joined us, which is over 500 people that attended all or some part of the summit this year, even though it was a Zoom deal. Thanks to Meredith St. Jean and the Mass Inc. staff for putting this all together and taking care of about 1,000 technical glitches that we ran into during it. They are truly remarkable. Thanks to all the speakers and panelists, and to everybody on the call. I hope to see you at our 8th annual summit in 2022. Hopefully we'll be able to come together and do that in person. And in the meantime, thank you and stay safe out there. We appreciate your participation. Have a great day.